The notebook was cheap. Danny Reeves had bought it from a corner shop in Cardiff for less than £2 before he left Earth. It had a bent cover and lined pages that smelled like dust. He carried it in his back pocket when he stepped off the shuttle and onto Andara Station for the first time. Everything around him was too big. The corridors of the Galoran Academy of Strategic Sciences stretched upward like cathedral ceilings, built for species that stood 8 or 9 feet tall. The air was heavier here, not enough to crush him, but enough to make every step feel like walking through shallow water. Danny was 5'8", thin, and pale from a Welsh winter that had refused to end. He looked like someone who had wandered into the wrong building. That he was one of only 3 humans ever admitted to the academy. The first 2 had dropped out within weeks. One left after a Kelmari student broke his collarbone during a training exercise. The other simply stopped eating, overwhelmed by the isolation of being the only soft body in a school built for predators. Danny knew their stories. He had read about them on the shuttle ride over and made his first notebook entry before he even landed. It said, "They try to become something they were not." The orientation hall was enormous. Hundreds of students filled the curved rows of seats, a zoo of alien biology. The Bravani were the tallest, reptilian and four-armed, their scales shifting between green and dark gold. The Kelmari were the widest, built like boulders wrapped in gray skin, with jaws that could crush steel. The Selvathi were the most graceful, thin and silver white, with wide dark eyes that recorded everything. Danny sat in the last row and said nothing. Instructor Galhan walked to the front of the hall. He was Bravani, easily 8 feet tall, and he moved with the slow confidence of something that had never been afraid in its life. His voice was deep enough to vibrate in Danny's chest. "This is applied conflict simulation," Galhan said. "You will command fleets. You will fight wars. You will watch soldiers die because of your decisions. And most of you will fail." He let the silence sit for a moment. Then his yellow eyes swept across the room and stopped on Danny. "We have a human this year," Galhan said. The way he said it made it sound like a curiosity, like finding an insect in a museum. "Tell me, human, what could your species possibly contribute to galactic warfare? You have no claws, no automat, no venom. Your homeworld is a mess of weather and war. What do you bring to this room?" Every eye in the hall turned to Danny. He could feel the weight of their stares, hundreds of alien faces waiting for him to stammer or shrink. Danny thought for a moment. Then he said, "A different perspective." The hall erupted in laughter. A massive Kelmari student in the front row, wider than Danny was tall, slammed his fist on his desk and barked out a sound that might have been amusement or contempt. "Prey animals," the Kelmari said loudly. His name was Dorith, and his voice carried across the room like a rock slide. "Prey animals playing at war." Danny did not respond. He did not blush or look away or clench his jaw. He simply looked at Dorith for a long moment, as if filing something away, and then turned his attention back to Galhan. The rest of the orientation covered rules, rankings, and consequences. Students were ranked publicly after every simulation. The bottom 10% at the end of the year were expelled. There was no curve, no mercy, and no second chances. Galhan made it clear that he had been running ACS for 40 years and that no student had ever completed his final scenario. "It is designed to break you," Galhan said, almost proudly. "It will teach you that some problems have no solution." After the orientation, the students filed out in groups, clustering by species. The Kelmari walked together like a wall of muscle. The Selvathi drifted in quiet pairs. Danny walked alone. He found a bench near one of the station's observation windows and sat down. Outside, the stars were thick and cold and impossibly far apart. He could see a gas giant in the distance, banded in orange and cream, orbited by a chain of silver moons. Danny opened his notebook and uncapped his pen. He did not write about fleet formations or weapon systems or the layout of the academy. Instead, He wrote about people. He wrote that the Bravani valued authority and respected age. He wrote that the Kelmari responded to physical dominance and shame. He wrote that the Selvathi were analytical but froze when things became chaotic. He wrote that Galhin used fear as a teaching tool and that Dorith needed an audience to feel powerful. He wrote for nearly an hour, filling 4 pages with small, careful handwriting that on the very first page, at the very top, he had written 2 words before he left Earth. They were still there, underlined once. Understand them. Danny closed the notebook, put it back in his pocket, and went to find his quarters. They were small and cold, and the bed was too firm, designed for something with thicker skin. He did not complain. He lay down, stared at the ceiling, and began a plan. Somewhere in the academy, Galhin was reviewing the new class roster. He paused on Danny's file, read it briefly, and closed it. He made a small note in the margin that IT said, "Will not last a month." The simulation room smelled like metal and ozone. It was a massive circular chamber buried in the lowest level of the academy, lined with projection nodes that could build entire star systems out of light and sound. When the systems powered on, the walls disappeared and students found themselves standing inside a war. Danny had never seen anything like it. The first scenario loaded around them like a dream becoming solid. Stars appeared. Planets formed. A fleet of warships materialized in the black, engines glowing blue, and suddenly Danny was standing on the bridge of a simulated command vessel with 6 other students, each assigned a role. Danny looked at his assignment. Logistics officer. He almost smiled. The other students barely glanced at him. The team leader was a Kelmari named Fosek, thick-necked and eager. The tactical officer was a Bravani who cracked all 4 knuckles before sitting down. The weapons officer was another Kelmari. The communications officer was a Selvathi named Reena, who looked calm on the surface but kept adjusting her seat. The scenario was simple. 2 fleets, 1 enemy. Destroy or be destroyed. Fosek did exactly what everyone expected a Kelmari to do. He ordered a full frontal assault within the first 30 seconds. The fleet surged forward, guns blazing, shields flaring. It was loud and violent and deeply satisfying to everyone in the room except Danny and Reena. Danny quietly opened his logistics panel and began working. Supply lines, fuel reserves, repair schedules, medical transports, evacuation routes. None of it was glamorous. Nobody looked at logistics during a battle. That was the point. In the other simulation running parallel, Dorith had been given fleet command. His approach made Fosek look cautious. Dorith threw everything forward in a single wave, overwhelming the enemy through sheer mass. His fleet won. The cost was 70% casualties. 7 out of every 10 simulated ships destroyed. Thousands of simulated crew dead. Galhin observed from his elevated platform and nodded. Victory, he declared. Costly but decisive. The Kelmari way. Dorith grinned with all of his teeth showing. The other Kelmari students pounded their desks in approval that Danny's team also won their scenario, though no one cared much about Fosek's leadership. What nobody noticed was that Danny had kept every supply ship intact, rerouted 3 medical transports to rescue stranded crews, and maintained fuel efficiency at a level the simulation's own systems flagged as unusual. While the battle raged, Danny had quietly saved more lives than any other student in the room. After class, the rankings were posted on the main board in the corridor. Dorith was near the top. Danny was in the middle. Invisible, he was walking back to his quarters when he heard footsteps behind him. Light, precise, deliberate. Selvathi footsteps. "You are the human," Reena said. It was not a question. Danny stopped and turned. "I am." Reena was tall for her species, almost Danny's height, with skin so pale it was nearly silver and eyes that were large, dark, and unblinking. She studied him the way a scientist studies a specimen. "Your logistics work was exceptional," she said. "I was monitoring the data feeds during the scenario. Your supply routing was better than anything I have seen in 2 years at this academy. Thank you, Danny said. It will not matter, Reena said flatly. This academy rewards aggression. The students who win are the ones who destroy the most ships, not the ones who save the most lives. Your approach is irrelevant here. Danny leaned against the corridor wall. What about your approach? Reena paused. Something flickered across her face. Frustration, maybe, or something older and more tired. My approach is theoretical, she said. I can calculate the optimal strategy for any scenario within seconds. But when the simulation begins and people start shouting and systems start failing, I freeze. My mind works perfectly. My nerves do not. Danny nodded slowly. So you have the answers, but cannot deliver them under pressure. And I can stay calm under pressure, but need better answers. He tilted his head. Sounds like we should work together. Reena stared at him for a long moment. You are serious. I am always serious, Danny said. I just do not look like it. They agreed to meet in the study halls the following evening. Reena left without saying goodbye, which Danny was beginning to understand was simply how Selvathi operated. He walked back to his quarters, sat on his hard bed, and opened his notebook. He wrote about Reena. He wrote that she was brilliant but trapped inside her own head, that she needed someone to trust during the chaos, someone who would not panic and would listen to her calculations when the noise got loud. Then he wrote about something else, a philosophy he had carried since he was young, something his grandfather had told him once while they sat on a stone wall overlooking a gray Welsh valley. You do not win wars by destroying the enemy. You win by making sure your people can keep fighting longer than theirs can. That night, in his private office, Galhan reviewed the simulation data one more time. He pulled up a logistics reports and paused on Danny's numbers. The supply efficiency rating was the highest the system had recorded in 11 years. Galhan stared at the screen. Then he closed the file and told himself it was a fluke. 6 weeks into the term, the public rankings told a story that nobody had predicted. Danny Reeves and Reena had climbed from the middle of the class to the top 15. They had not done it with a single spectacular victory. They had done it by never falling apart. Every scenario, every simulation, every crisis that Galhan threw at the class, Danny and Reena survived. They did not always win in the traditional sense. They rarely destroyed more enemy ships than their opponents. But they lost fewer troops, held more ground, recovered faster, and maintained their forces longer than anyone else. In a course designed to simulate extended warfare, endurance mattered more than anyone wanted to admit. That Danny's reputation grew quietly. He was not loud about it. He did not challenge anyone or boast about his rankings. He simply showed up, did his work, and left. This bothered some students more than arrogance would have. Arrogance they understood. Silence made them nervous. Dorith was the most bothered of all. He still sat at the top of the rankings, but the gap was closing, and closing in a way that made no sense to him. He was stronger, faster, more aggressive, and better armed in every scenario. Yet the human kept climbing. He is a parasite, Dorith said one evening in the dining hall, loud enough for everyone to hear. He hides behind his numbers and his little Selvathi calculator. He has never won a real fight. Danny was eating alone at a corner table. He heard every word, but did not look up. Then the day came that Galhan had clearly been waiting for. He announced a one-on-one scenario. Direct opposition. 2 students, 2 fleets, 1 battlefield. The pairings were posted on the main board. Danny Reeves versus Dorith. The simulation room was packed. Students who had no reason to be there filled the observation galleries. Even faculty members came to watch. Everyone expected the same thing. Dorith would crush the human. It would be fast, brutal, and final. The scenario loaded. 2 fleets of equal size, facing each other across a simulated star system. Dorith had command of the red fleet. Danny had the blue. Dorith attacked within the first minute. His entire fleet surged forward in a classic Kelmari hammer formation, designed to smash through the center of any defensive line. It was powerful, direct, and terrifying. Danny retreated. The observation gallery erupted. Gasps, laughter, a few groans. Retreating in a direct challenge was considered the deepest shame at the Academy. It was what prey did. Dorothy's fleet roared forward, claiming territory, destroying supply depots, and planting flags across the system. The human runs, someone said from the gallery. Dorith himself was grinning inside his command bridge, ordering his fleet to pursue, but Danny had not run. He had moved. Over the next 3 simulated days, while Dorith celebrated his advance, Danny's smaller, faster ships began picking apart the edges. He hit fuel convoys. He jammed communications between Dorothy's scattered squadrons. He destroyed 3 unmanned supply stations that Dorith had left unguarded because he had never needed to guard anything before HFY the second day. Dorothy's fleet was spread across the entire system, holding territory it could not supply. His ships began running low on fuel. His repair crews had no parts. His forward units could not reach his command ship because Danny had placed electronic interference fields across every relay point. HFY the third day, Dorothy's massive fleet was dead in the water. Ships floated in the dark with empty fuel tanks and silent engines. Not destroyed, just stopped. Danny moved his fleet into position around the frozen armada and opened a communication channel. "I accept your surrender," he said calmly. The simulation ended. The final score appeared on the main display. Danny had won. He had not fought a single major engagement. He had won a war without a battle. The room was silent. Not the impressed silence that followed a great victory. A confused silence. The kind of silence that happens when people see something they do not have a word for. Galhin stood slowly from his observation platform. His forehand were clasped behind his back. He stared at Danny for a very long time. "Explain," Galhin said. "One word. A command." Danny stood in the center of the simulation room, small and pale and completely calm. He looked up at Galhin and said, "He expected me to fight like him. I fought like me." Galhin said nothing. He turned and left the room. The students filed out in near silence, whispering among themselves. Reena caught Danny's eye from the gallery and gave a small nod. The tiniest Selvathi smile. Dorith did not move from his command chair for several minutes after the simulation ended. When he finally stood, his gray face was unreadable. He walked out of the room without speaking to anyone. That night, Danny wrote in his notebook. He wrote about supply lines and communication networks and the mathematics of overextension. Then he wrote one more line at the bottom of the page. "He will come for me outside the simulation now. That is where it gets real." Danny closed the notebook and put it under his pillow. He did not sleep well that night, but he slept. It happened 3 days later, in the lower corridors of Ondara Station, where the lights were dim and the security cameras were spaced far apart. Danny was walking back from the library when he turned a corner and found Dorith waiting for him. Dorith was not alone. 4 other Kelmari students stood behind him, each one wider than a doorframe. The corridor was narrow enough that there was no way around them. Danny stopped walking and stood still. "You made me look foolish," Dorith said. His voice was low and controlled, which was more frightening than shouting. A shouting Kelmari was emotional. A quiet one had made a decision. Danny looked at the 5 of them. Each one could break him in half without trying. His heart was beating fast, but his face showed nothing. "I want a simulation," Danny said. "That is what the course is for." "You did not win," Dorith said, stepping closer. "You tricked me. You ran and hid and cut wires like a coward. That is not victory. That is sabotage." Danny did not step back. "Your fleet stopped moving. Your soldiers could not fight. You had no fuel, no food, and no communications. In a real war, every one of them would be dead. That is not a trick, Dorith. That is logistics." Dorothy's hands tightened into fists the size of Danny's head. The other Kelmari shifted their weight, ready. Danny spoke again, and this time his voice was very quiet. "If you hit me, you will be expelled. You know that. The Academy has zero tolerance for physical violence outside of sanctioned training. Your family is a military dynasty. 3 generations of Kelmari commanders. If you are expelled for beating up a human half your size in a dark corridor, that legacy ends with you. Dorith froze. His jaw clenched so hard that Danny could hear the bones creak. And your friends here? Danny continued, glancing at the 4 behind Dorith. They will be expelled too. All of them. For what? Because a human outsmarted you in a game? The silence was thick and heavy. Danny could see the rage in Dorothy's eyes, burning like something trapped. But underneath the rage, there was something else. Something Danny had seen many times before. You are not angry at me, Danny said softly. You are angry because the way you were taught to win does not work anymore. Your whole life, you were told that strength is enough, that being bigger and louder and more violent is all it takes. And then a human half your weight sat in a chair, moved some numbers around a screen, and made your entire fleet useless. That is what terrifies you, not me. The idea that everything you were taught might be wrong. For a long moment, nobody moved. Then Dorith let out a slow breath. His fists unclenched. He did not say anything. He just turned and walked away. The other 4 followed. Danny leaned against the wall and let himself breathe. His hands were shaking. He put them in his pockets so nobody would see. The following week, Galhan stood before the class and announced the final scenario. He called it the Burning Corridor. 3 hostile factions occupy the Selene star system, Galhan said. The central star is collapsing. It will go supernova in approximately 48 simulated hours. 10 million civilians are trapped on stations and colonies throughout the system. Your mission is to evacuate as many civilians as possible while preventing the 3 factions from starting a wider war. He paused and let the weight of it settle. This scenario was created 20 years ago. It has been attempted by 114 students in command positions. Every single one of them has failed. Some tried to fight all 3 factions. Some abandoned the civilians and focused on military objectives. Some negotiated with one faction and were betrayed by the others. He looked across the room with his yellow eyes. No one has ever saved more than 4 million of the 10 million. Most saved fewer than 2 million. Several have saved none. The students are quiet. Danny could feel the tension in the room. This was the scenario Galhan had warned them about on the first day. The unsolvable problem. Danny read through the scenario brief carefully. 3 factions, each with different cultures, different fears, different needs. A dying star. Millions of people with nowhere to go. Not enough ships, not enough time, not enough trust that he read it again. And then he smiled. Reena noticed. What? She asked. Danny looked at her with a light in his eyes that she had not seen before. This is not a war scenario, Reena, he said. This is a people scenario, and that is what humans do. The simulation loaded like a storm rolling in. Stars appeared, then planets, then the angry red glow of a dying sun at the center of the Selene system. Stations and colonies blinked into existence across the map, each one a cluster of 10,000 or 100,000 simulated lives. The clock in the corner of every screen read 48 hours and began counting down. Every student in the class was assigned a role. Fleet commanders, squadron leaders, communications officers, medical coordinators. In the center of it all, at the main coordination console, sat Danny Reeves. Galhan had placed him there deliberately. Everyone knew it. The old Bravani instructor wanted to see what a human would do with the weight of 10 million lives on his shoulders. Danny looked at the map and took a long breath. Then he did something that no student had ever done in 20 years of this scenario, that he opened communication channels to all 3 hostile factions at the same time. The room went tense. Students looked at each other. Opening communications was not unusual. Opening them to all 3 enemies simultaneously was either brilliant or suicidal. The 3 factions appeared on screen. The Drothi Confederacy, a militaristic insectoid species that controlled the northern quadrant of the system. The Pelori Trade Union, a merchant coalition that held the shipping lanes. And the remnants of Solhar, a religious group that believed the dying star was sacred and should not be abandoned. Every previous student had treated them as obstacles, enemies to defeat or ignore, threats to manage. Danny treated them as frightened people. "The star is dying," Danny said, his voice calm and steady across all 3 channels. "None of us caused this. None of us can stop it. In 48 hours, everything in this system will be gone. Every station, every colony, every ship that stays behind. I'm not here to fight any of you. I am here to get people out alive. All people, including yours." The factions did not respond immediately. Danny had expected that. He turned to his team. "Reena," he said, "I need a complete resource map in 5 minutes. Every ship, every fuel depot, every medical station. All 3 factions included." Reena was already working. Her analytical mind was perfect for this. No chaos, no shouting, just data flowing in clean streams across her console. Then Danny did something that shocked the room even more. He turned to Dorith, who had been assigned as a military escort commander. "Dorith," Danny said, "I need you to lead the convoy escort through the northern corridor. The Drothi will test us. They will send ships to probe our formations. I need someone who looks strong enough that they will think twice before attacking." Dorith stared at him. The entire class held its breath. "You want me to protect civilians," Dorith said flatly. "I want you to be a guardian," Danny said. "That is the oldest Kelmari honor there is. Older than conquest. Older than war. Your ancestors did not begin as conquerors, Dorith. They began as protectors. I am asking you to remember that." Something shifted in Dorith's gray face. He said nothing for a moment. Then he turned to his console and began organizing his escort fleet. Danny went to work on the factions. He studied Reena's data and found what he was looking for. Each faction needed something that the evacuation could provide. The Drothi were running low on medical supplies because their war posture had drained their reserves. Danny offered them full access to the evacuation medical transports in exchange for a ceasefire and safe passage through their territory. The Pelori Trade Union cared about one thing: profit. Danny offered them exclusive transport contracts for the refugee resettlement, a deal that would be worth billions in the years to come. The remnants of Solhar were the hardest. They believed the star was holy and that leaving was a sin. Danny did not argue with their beliefs. He spoke to their leader directly and said, "Your faith teaches that the light of Solhar lives in the hearts of the faithful, not in the fire of the star. If your people die here, that light dies with them. Let them carry it to a new home." The Solhar leader was silent for a very long time. Then she agreed. The hours ground on. Systems failed. New crises erupted. A fuel depot exploded. A Drothi commander broke the ceasefire and attacked a convoy. Danny talked him down in 11 minutes, offering replacement medical supplies from a reserve he had kept hidden for exactly this kind of moment. Reena fed him data without stopping. Dorith's escort fleet held the northern corridor like a wall. The other students, caught up in the momentum, began working harder than they ever had. The clock ticked down. 40 hours. 30. 20. 10 ships poured out of the system in rivers of light, carrying families and workers and soldiers and priests. The dying star swelled and turned white at its edges to the 2-hour mark. The last convoy cleared the outer boundary. Danny counted the numbers on his screen and leaned back in his chair. 9.7 million. Out of 10 million. Saved. The star collapsed. The system folded inward in a flash of white that filled every screen before the simulation cut to black. The room was completely silent. Galhan stood on his platform, staring at the results. His 4 arms hung at his sides. His yellow eyes did not blink. Then he spoke. His voice was rough, as if something had caught in his throat. "No one has ever passed this scenario." He paused. "Until now." The assembly hall had not been this full in years. Every seat was taken. Students, faculty, and even a few off-station dignitaries sat in rows that curved upward like the inside of a shell. The air buzzed with low conversation that stopped the moment Commandant Yesik walked to the podium. Yesik was old. She was Bravani like Galhan, but where Galhan was sharp and intimidating, Yesik was weathered and calm. Her scales had faded to a pale bronze, and she moved slowly, but her eyes were the clearest in the room. She had run the Galoran Academy for 30 years and had seen every kind of student pass through its halls. Warriors, geniuses, prodigies, and failures. She had seen them all. She looked out at the crowd and began to speak. 20 years ago, I helped design a simulation called the Burning Corridor. It was never meant to be solved. It was meant to teach a lesson about humility, about the limits of power, about the reality that some problems are too complex for any single mind, any single strategy, any single species to overcome. She paused and let the words settle. In 20 years, 114 students attempted that scenario. All of them failed. Many of them were brilliant. Some of them went on to become fleet commanders and planetary governors. But none of them could save more than 4 million lives out of 10 million. Most saved far fewer. Her eyes moved across the hall until they found Danny, sitting in the third row between Reena and an empty seat. 3 days ago, a human student saved 9.7 million. The hall was so quiet that Danny could hear the hum of the station's air recyclers. He did not do it by being the strongest person in the room. Yesik continued. He was the weakest physically. He did not do it by being the fastest or the most aggressive. He did it by understanding people. He looked at 3 hostile factions and saw not enemies, but frightened communities with needs. He looked at a dying star and saw not a military problem, but a human one. He found common ground where everyone before him had found only conflict. She straightened slightly, her old spine pulling itself upright. I have submitted a recommendation to the Concord Strategic Advisory Council. The council advises galactic leaders during real crises, wars, disasters, refugee emergencies, the situations that decide whether civilizations survive or fall. She looked directly at Danny. I have recommended Danny Reeves for a seat on that council. He would be the youngest member in its history and the first human to serve. The hall erupted, not in cheering, but in that particular alien murmur that meant 1,000 minds were processing something unexpected. Danny sat very still. His face was calm, but his hands gripped his knees under the desk. Yesik invited him to speak. Danny stood, walked to the front of the hall, and looked out at the hundreds of faces staring back at him. Bravani, Kelmari, Selvathi, and a dozen other species he had spent months studying and writing about in his cheap notebook that he kept it short. Where I come from, he said, we have a saying, you catch more flies with honey than with vinegar. I do not know if that translates well across species, but the idea is simple. I did not come here to prove that humans are stronger or smarter or better than anyone. I came here to listen, to learn how each of you thinks, what each of you fears, and what each of you needs. And then I try to help. That is all I did. He walked back to his seat. The hall was quiet again, but it was a different kind of quiet now. Not confused, thoughtful. After the assembly, the crowd thinned slowly. Students left in small groups, talking in low voices. Danny stayed behind, waiting for the hall to empty. Galhan found him near the exit. The old instructor stood in front of Danny and said nothing for a long time. Then he spoke, and his voice was softer than Danny had ever heard it. When you arrived, Galhan said, I wrote a note in your file. It said you would not last the month. I was wrong. I have been wrong about very few things in 40 years of teaching, but I was wrong about you. Danny looked up at him. What did you expect? Fear, Galhan said. I expected fear. Every human before you was afraid. Afraid of failing, afraid of the other species, afraid of the simulations. I thought you would be the same. And what did you get instead? Danny asked, Galhan looked at him with his ancient yellow eyes and said, "Someone who walked into a room full of strangers and wondered how to help every single one of them. I have never seen that before. Not in any species." Danny nodded, but said nothing. Galhan turned and walked away, his forearms folded behind his back, his heavy footsteps echoing down the empty corridor. Reena was waiting for Danny at the observation deck. The stars outside the window were bright and endless, scattered across the black like salt on a dark table. She stood with her hands clasped behind her back in the way Selvathi did when they were being patient. "The council position," she said. "Will you accept it?" Danny leaned on the railing and looked out at the stars. "I think so," he said, "but not yet. I want to go home first." "Home," Reena repeated, as if testing the word. "Wales," Danny said. "Rain and green hills and stone walls. I want to sit on my grandfather's bench and listen to the wind for a while before I decide anything." Reena nodded. She did not fully understand, but she accepted it, which was the Selvathi way. They stood together in comfortable silence, watching the stars turn. Footsteps sounded behind them, heavy and deliberate. Danny turned and saw Dorith walking down the corridor. The massive Kelmari stopped a few paces away. He looked at Danny with an expression that was hard to read under all that gray muscle and bone. Then Dorith nodded. Once, slow and deep. A Kelmari sign of respect, the kind reserved for elders and warriors who had proven themselves beyond question. He walked on without saying a word. Danny watched him go, then reached into his back pocket and pulled out his notebook. It was thick now, swollen with months of observations. Hundreds of pages filled with notes about every species, every culture, every student, every fear, and every hope he had encountered at the academy. He opened it to the first page. The words were still there, written in his own hand on the day he left Earth, before he knew anything about this place or these people. Point two words. Simple and clear. Understand them. Danny closed the notebook, put it back in his pocket, and looked out at the stars one last time before heading home.